The wind pushed hard across the Montana flats, carrying the smell of pine and the bite of snow not yet fallen. Margaret Hayes sat stiff in the back of the wagon, her fingers wrapped tight around the handle of a brass lantern, the glass smudged with soot from years of use. It was the only thing left to her from her husband, the same lantern he had carried on the night he never came home. The driver snapped his reins, urging the team forward as the town's lights came into view, a scatter of windows glowing against the endless dark. Margaret's throat tightened as she thought of stepping down alone, of strangers' eyes waiting to measure her worth in a single glance. She pressed her lips together, steadying herself, and whispered a prayer too faint for anyone to hear. Sheriff Caleb Turner stood near the hitching post outside the general store, his hat brim low against the sharp wind. He had buried too many hopes in this ground to expect much from the night, but duty had called him when word spread that a widow was arriving with nowhere to stay. He watched the wagon roll in, the horses steaming, the wheels creaking as they stopped in a cloud of dust. The driver muttered a greeting, swung down, and offered his hand to the lone passenger. Caleb's eyes fixed on her, on the way she held that lantern tight against her chest, as if it were armor, on the way her shoulders squared, though her chin trembled. She stepped to the ground carefully, her boots worn, the hem of her dress frayed from miles of road. She looked smaller than he expected, yet there was something in her eyes, tired as they were, that spoke of a fight not yet beaten out of her. She carried no trunk but a small battered case, and when she set it down it landed soft, too light for a life lived so long. Caleb felt a stir of pity, though he tried to keep it from showing. Pity was not what she needed, he reckoned, and she would not thank him for it anyway. The driver tipped his hat, mumbled that she had no kin, no coin worth speaking of, and no place to rest. Then he clambered back to his seat, eager to be on his way before the storm rolled in. The wheels rattled off into the dark, leaving Margaret standing alone in the middle of the street with only her case and her lantern. Caleb stepped forward, his boots crunching over hard-packed dirt, and cleared his throat. "The cabin out by the ridge is empty but for me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "If you've a mind to, it will keep the cold off." Her breath caught at his words, though she tried to keep her face still. She nodded once, fingers tightening on the lantern handle until her knuckles whitened. Caleb reached for her case, surprised by its weight, then gestured toward the road that wound out of town. Side by side they walked into the deepening night, the glow of her lantern bobbing between them. The townsfolk peered from their windows, whispers curling in the shadows, but neither turned to look. The land stretched wide and lonesome around them. Yet in that small circle of light, two broken lives had begun to share a path neither expected. The cabin sat low against the ridge, its roof patched with cedar shingles that gleamed pale in the moonlight. When Caleb pushed the door open, the air inside smelled of wood smoke long gone cold. Margaret stepped across the threshold with her case clutched in one hand and the lantern in the other, her eyes sweeping the single room that would now be hers as much as his. A narrow bed pressed against one wall, a small cot folded near the hearth, a rough table scarred by years of use, and shelves bare but sturdy. She set her case down without fuss, shoulders squared, though the silence pressed heavy between them. Caleb removed his hat, hung it by the door, and muttered that she should take the bed he would manage with the cot. She nodded, but her chin lifted with the faintest hint of pride, as if to say she did not ask for charity, only for a chance to stand on her own feet. The next morning, the world woke in frost. Caleb left early, his horse's hooves drumming down the trail as he rode the line of the hills, watching for smoke or strangers. Margaret stayed behind, her shawl tied close, her hands already busy with broom and rag. She swept dust from corners, scrubbed the table with water hauled from the creek, and coaxed the stove into flame. The smell of beans and cornmeal filled the cabin by the time he returned near dusk. His shoulders bent with weariness. He entered to find her setting 2 plates on the table, her face pale but determined. He muttered thanks under his breath, sitting stiff as she ladled food. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. Days took shape in that same quiet pattern. Caleb rode at dawn, patrolling the valley, and Margaret moved through the cabin with steady purpose. She mended his worn shirts, her needle flashing neat and quick in the lamplight, and spread his blankets across the line to catch the Sunday. She tended to the chickens in the yard, scattering grain with soft words, as if the creatures might understand kindness better than men did. Each evening he found the hearth glowing, the smell of bread or stew lingering, and though he said little, he noticed the way the cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. Yet he kept his distance. He spoke little beyond what duty demanded, convinced she was too fragile for the life he lived, a widow worn down by sorrow. Margaret sensed it, the way his eyes lingered but slid away, the way his voice stayed even, polite but never warm. At night she lay awake, listening to the creak of his cot, the sound of him turning as though he fought battles even in sleep. She clutched her lantern close, its soft glow the only comfort against the thought that she was still a stranger beneath his roof. And yet, in the space between silence and breath, something shifted. Caleb found himself listening for the faint hum of her voice as she worked, and Margaret found her hands trembling less when she set a plate before him. They were not friends, not yet, but the bond grew out of necessity, forged in the small acts of living side by side. Neither dared name it, but both felt the stir of something waiting, like the first warmth beneath the cold earth of spring. The days stretched into weeks, each one marked by the rhythm of chores and the slow turning of seasons. Margaret woke early, the light still pale over the ridge, and tied her shawl tight as she stepped into the yard. The chickens clucked and scattered around her boots as she tossed grain, her breath rising in soft clouds against the chill morning air. She gathered eggs into her apron with careful hands, humming under her breath, as though to remind herself that she belonged in this place. Inside the cabin, the stove glowed faintly with embers she had coaxed from the night before, the smell of coffee drifting through the room by the time Caleb returned from the barn. He nodded when he saw the table set, his eyes catching on the faint smile that tugged at her lips before he sat down to eat. Life together was not easy, but it was steady. Margaret kept the cabin in order, sweeping dust from corners, mending curtains with neat stitches, and patching the knees of Caleb's worn trousers. She washed shirts in the creek until her fingers stung from the cold water, then spread them across the line to dry in the Sunday. Caleb noticed the way his clothes no longer hung in tatters, the way the air inside his home smelled faintly of soap and fresh bread instead of smoke and leather. He said little of it, but each evening as he pulled a shirt over his shoulders, he felt the difference settle against his skin like quiet gratitude. By dusk, Margaret listened for the sound of his boots on the porch. The heavy tread was always the same, steady and strong, but to her it had begun to mean more than simple routine. She would lift her head from her sewing as the door creaked open, her heart catching at the sight of him filling the doorway, dust clinging to his coat, his jaw set with the day's weariness. He often looked surprised to find the lamp already lit, the table waiting, the smell of stew or bread drifting from the hearth. She did not speak much as he sat, but she found herself watching the way his shoulders eased when he bent over the meal, as though the weight of the world grew lighter in that small circle of light. One evening, she slipped while lifting the flour tin and ended up with a streak of white dust across her nose. Caleb, coming in from the yard, paused at the sight. For the first time in months, his lips curved into the barest shadow of a smile. Margaret laughed, quick and soft, brushing at her face with flustered hands. The sound startled them both, filling the room with something warmer than the fire's glow. He turned away before she could see how it lingered in his eyes, but the memory stayed with him through the night. The cabin no longer felt hollow. The creak of the rocking chair, the crackle of firewood, the faint hum of her voice as she stitched by lantern light, wove themselves into its walls. They did not speak of what was changing, but each knew in silence that the life they had begun to share was slowly shaping itself into a home. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting a soft glow against the cabin walls, the shadows stretching long and thin across the floorboards. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a hollow whistle, the sound filling the silence between them. Margaret sat at the table, her hands folded around her lantern, though it was not lit, her fingers tracing the worn brass handle as if it anchored her to the room. Caleb leaned back in his chair near the fire, boots resting heavy on the floor, his hat pulled low over his brow. He had said little since supper, and she had not pressed, but the weight of words left unspoken hung between them. At last Margaret lifted her chin, her eyes catching the faint light. Her voice was quiet, trembling at first, but steadying as the truth pressed to the surface. "My husband was not the man I thought he was," she said, each word slow as though dragged from a wound. "He borrowed from men who had no mercy, gambled away the little we owned, and left me with nothing but shame. When the debts came due, he ran from them, and when they found him, he paid with his life." She pressed her fingers tighter around the lantern, her breath shivering. "After he died, those men turned their eyes on me, called me worthless, cursed me for his sins. I had no home left, no kin who would take me in, only this lantern and the road west." Caleb did not move for a long moment. His jaw tightened, and the muscle along his cheek twitched as he stared into the fire. At last he spoke, his voice rough but even. "You think you're the only one carrying ghosts," he said. His eyes shifted to hers, dark and tired. "I was sworn to protect this town, sworn to stand between my brother and any bullet. Yet when the fight came, I failed him." Caleb's hands curled into fists against his knees. "He fell in the street with me only a step away. They say it was chance, a gunman faster than most. But I know the truth. It was hesitation. My hesitation. If I had drawn quicker, if I had stood closer, maybe he'd still be alive." The silence that followed was not empty, but thick with the weight of confessions long buried. Margaret's breath caught as she studied him, the hard lines of his face cut deeper by grief. Slowly, she pushed her lantern aside and reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. His skin was rough, warm, calloused by years of work, and he almost pulled back before letting her touch rest there. Her fingers lingered, light but certain, as if to say she did not see him as less for what he carried. Caleb's eyes closed briefly, his shoulders sagging as though the fight in him eased for the first time in years. Two broken pasts, spoken aloud in the dim glow of the fire, bound them closer than silence ever could. Their shame and sorrow were not gone, but they no longer sat alone in the shadows. For the first time, they faced them together, and in that fragile honesty, something steadier than fear began to take root. The storm came sudden from the mountains, black clouds rolling low, thunder shaking the windows until the panes rattled. Caleb pulled the shutters closed, his shoulders broad in the flicker of lightning, while Margaret set the lantern on the table and struck a match with careful hands. The small flame steadied against the dark, its glow chasing the sharp edges of fear from the room. Rain pounded the roof, a steady roar that drowned out the world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, they found themselves sealed together, with nothing to do but face the long hours side by side. Margaret sat at the table with a basket of mending, her needle flashing through torn cloth while her lips pressed tight in concentration. Caleb brought in a saddle strap that had split, setting himself near the fire to repair it. The smell of damp leather filled the room, mixing with the bitter strength of coffee she had brewed. He poured 2 tin cups, sliding one across the table without a word. She wrapped her hands around it, the warmth seeping into her fingers, and whispered a soft thank you. He only nodded, yet his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than he meant before he bent back to his work. For a while, the only sounds were the hiss of rain, the crack of firewood, and the scratch of needle through cloth. But then he cursed low, when the strap buckled against him, pricking his finger. Margaret's laugh broke the quiet, light and unexpected, spilling across the table like sunshine through a crack in storm clouds. She lifted a hand to her mouth, her cheeks flushed, but she could not take it back. Caleb looked up, startled, and felt something shift inside him, a small tug at the edges of a heart he thought long closed. He tried to keep his expression steady, but a faint curve touched his lips, awkward yet real. The hours stretched, yet neither grew restless. They passed the basket back and forth, teasing over crooked stitches, sharing quiet words between sips of coffee that had grown lukewarm. Margaret found her hands trembling less when she worked with him near, her voice steadier each time she answered his. She caught herself listening for the sound of his breath, even and calm, as though it tethered her in the storm. Caleb noticed how she leaned slightly toward him when she spoke, how the tension in her shoulders eased when his voice filled the silence. The weight he carried seemed lighter, with her laughter still hanging in the air. By the time the storm softened to a steady drizzle, the fire had burned low, and their heads bent close over the same scrap of cloth, their hands brushing once, then lingering a heartbeat too long. Neither pulled away quickly, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full, alive with something both feared to name. Outside, the land soaked in rain, but inside the cabin, a different seed had been planted, quiet and undeniable, waiting to grow. The first frost of winter clung to the grass when Caleb rode into town for supplies, his breath steaming in the cold air. Margaret stayed behind, humming as she swept the porch, the lantern set beside her like a companion. She had begun to feel the weight of his home turning into something she could share. But by the time Caleb returned with the wagon creaking under sacks of flour and salt, his face was tight and his eyes dark. He carried the goods inside without a word, his jaw set as though he had bitten down on iron. Margaret sensed it instantly, the way silence pressed heavier than usual, and she asked softly what had happened. Caleb shook his head at first, but when her hand brushed his sleeve, he exhaled a breath that seemed to have been held too long. "They are talking," he said, his voice low. "The men at the store, the women by the well. They say I am reckless for keeping you here. They call you cursed, an outlaw's widow who will only bring ruin." The words struck her like cold water, though she had known whispers would follow her. She had hoped distance might shield her from them, but the sound of Caleb's voice carrying those words brought the shame back raw and sharp. She turned away quickly, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, her throat tight with the old ache she thought she had buried. He reached for her, but she moved past him into the cabin, her steps quick and unsteady. That night, while he worked by the fire, she sat with her mending in silence, her stitches uneven, where her hands trembled. She heard his voice, steady as ever, but she felt the weight of the town pressing between them. Later, when he slept on the cot, she lay awake staring into the dark, her locket clutched in her palm. Every cruel word she had endured before echoed back, louder now, because they did not wound only her, they threatened to stain him too. The next day, she ventured into town herself, needing thread and soap, though her stomach churned at the thought. She kept her chin lifted, but the whispers met her the moment she stepped off the wagon. Two women turned away with sharp laughter, one muttering blind loyalty under her breath. At the counter, the store clerk hesitated before handing her change, as though her very touch carried disgrace. Margaret held her head high until she reached the wagon, but once the wheels turned toward home, her shoulders sagged and her eyes burned. When she returned, she moved through the cabin with a quietness that even Caleb could not ignore. He asked what had been said, but she only shook her head, unwilling to place the ugliness into his ears. Yet as she folded his shirts and stirred the stew, she feared every moment that her presence would cost him the respect he needed to do his duty. That night, when he told her to rest, she whispered so low he almost missed it. "I fear I have ruined you." He lifted his head sharply, but before he could answer, she turned her face away. The bond between them, fragile but growing, trembled under the weight of suspicion and scorn. The cabin still smelled of bread, the fire still burned, but silence pressed thick, heavy with the fear that what they were building could be broken by voices outside their walls. The night came sharp with wind, the moon veiled in clouds that swallowed the stars. Caleb had felt it building all day, a tension in the air that set his horse restless and the dog barking at shadows. He cleaned his rifle by the fire, each stroke of the cloth deliberate, while Margaret sat nearby with her sewing untouched in her lap. She could feel it too, though neither spoke of it. When the first echo of hoofbeats rolled through the valley, she lifted her head, her breath catching, and Caleb was already on his feet. Voices carried across the dark, rough and taunting, the kind that made the blood run cold. A gang of riders drew near, their lanterns swinging wild, their laughter thick with menace. Caleb recognized them before he saw their faces, the same men tied to Margaret's late husband, men who had once run with him, and now sought what they claimed was theirs. They reined in before the cabin, their leader shouting into the night, "We know she's here, the outlaw's widow. She's got what belongs to us." Margaret froze, her fingers clutching the edge of the chair. Caleb stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand, his voice steady as stone. "You'll find nothing here but trouble. Go back the way you came." The leader sneered, his scar catching the lantern light, and swung down from his saddle. "Not till she gives us what he owed, or pays with more than words." With a signal, two men lit torches and flung them toward the barn, the dry wood catching fast until flames licked the sky. Caleb's pulse hammered, but he did not step aside. He planted himself square in front of the cabin, his figure dark against the fire's glow. "If you want her, you'll have to take me first." The riders laughed, their pistols gleaming, and the odds stretched long against him. Behind him, Margaret's fear rose hot, but so did something else. She had lived too long in silence, too long letting others decide her worth. Not tonight. She slipped to the back of the cabin, her hands moving quick over shelves and cupboards. She remembered the stories her husband's men had told, careless in their arrogance, of where they liked to drink, how they rode in patterns like wolves, circling prey until it panicked. She took a lantern in one hand, a pan of ashes in the other, and moved to the far side of the yard. With calm she did not feel, she tossed the ashes high into the wind and raised the lantern, calling out sharp and clear, "This way. You'll find what you're after here." The gang turned, spurred by greed, charging toward the glow, but the path curved into a low ditch hidden by grass, a trap she had noticed in daylight. Their horses stumbled, chaos breaking their charge, shouts rising as Caleb seized the chance. He fired into the air, his rifle cracking like thunder, and rushed forward, driving them back with every ounce of fury he carried. The fire roared. The gang cursed and scattered, their threats flung into the night as they fled. When it was over, Caleb stood with his chest heaving, the flames dying behind him, and Margaret clutched the lantern, her hands shaking. He turned to her, his face streaked with sweat and soot, and for a moment words failed him. She had given him the one thing he could not fight, alone, an edge, a chance, a partner. He crossed the yard, his voice rough with awe. "You saved us, Margaret." Her breath trembled, but her chin lifted. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." The night after the fire smelled of smoke and damp earth, the ashes from the barn still smoldering, as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. Caleb leaned heavy against the porch post, his shirt torn and dark with blood near the shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. He had fought through the pain while the gang scattered, but now that silence returned, it pressed hard, each throb reminding him how close he had come to falling. Margaret stepped out with a basin of water and a strip of cloth torn from her own shawl, her eyes set with a determination sharper than fear. She guided him to sit, her hands trembling only once before she steadied them, dipping the cloth into the water and pressing it against his wound. He hissed at the sting, his jaw tightening, but he did not push her away. She leaned close, her voice quiet, yet firm. "You cannot hide from me, Caleb. Not this pain, not the fear of it. I will not let you." He looked at her then, at the curve of her cheek lit by the weak glow of morning, and saw not pity in her gaze but something fiercer, something that reached past the wound to the man himself. For a long moment he could not find words, only the weight of her touch against him, the warmth of her presence holding him steady. When she finished binding the wound, her hands lingered on his arm, her head bowed as though she could not keep the words inside any longer. "I cannot lose you too," she whispered, her breath shivering as tears blurred her eyes. "I have already buried one man who chose recklessness over love. I could not bear to watch you follow him." The raw truth in her voice cut deeper than the pain in his shoulder, and for the first time Caleb felt the walls he had built crumble. His voice cracked as he spoke, low and unguarded. "Margaret, you have given me a reason to breathe beyond duty, beyond this badge. I thought my life was meant only for silence, for work and for penance. But you have changed that. You have made this place a home." Her tears fell then, but they were not only of sorrow. She pressed her forehead lightly against his arm, her hands clasping his with a fierce grip. "And you, Caleb, have given me more than protection. You have given me a place where I am not judged by what I lost, but by what I can still be. I have not known partnership until now." The word hung between them like a vow, simple, yet binding. The day stretched on, with the smell of charred wood in the air. Neighbors riding by to stare at the blackened ruin but saying little. Caleb ignored them, his focus fixed on the woman who moved through the cabin with a steadiness that shamed his doubts. Every time his strength faltered, she was there, lifting what he could not, watching the horizon with ears sharper than sight. By evening, as the sun sank over the scarred fields, he realized they were no longer two lonely souls pressed together by circumstance. They were bound by choice, by fire, and by the fragile, unshakable truth that neither could stand alone anymore. The winter wind came sharp from the north, rattling the loose boards on the barn and cutting through the gaps in the cabin walls. Caleb rose before dawn, as he always did, his shoulders still stiff but healing, while Margaret stirred the fire and set the kettle to boil. Their days had found a rhythm again, but beneath the small comforts ran an unease she could not shake. She had overheard the whispers when she last ventured into town, voices low but sharp enough to wound. The men at the smithy spoke of petitioning the marshal, claiming the sheriff had disgraced his office by taking in the widow of an outlaw. Their words followed her home, lodged deep, and she carried them in silence. At the table she stitched a torn sleeve, her hands steady though her thoughts twisted like thorns. She imagined Caleb stripped of his badge, cast out by the very people he had sworn to protect, all because of her. She told herself she had brought nothing but shame, that whatever peace he had found in her presence would not withstand the judgment of the town. Each time she heard the dog bark at the road, she feared it would be the marshal riding in, carrying a paper that ended all Caleb had left of honor. Caleb noticed the change. Though she tried to hide it, she spoke less, her laughter gone, her gaze slipping away when his lingered. One evening, when he asked if something troubled her, she smiled faintly and said only that she was tired. He did not press her, but the silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. He sat by the fire mending tack, his eyes drawn to her bent head as she stitched, wondering what shadows pressed so hard against her shoulders. Late one night, when the fire had burned low and his breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, Margaret sat awake, staring at her satchel resting near the door. She pulled it close and began folding her few belongings, each motion quiet but sure. Her shawl, the spare dress, the small locket she always wore pressed once against her lips before she laid it gently inside. She told herself this was mercy, that leaving would spare him the disgrace the town meant to heap upon him. Her heart ached with every fold of cloth, but she pressed on, whispering into the silence that he deserved more than she could ever give. When the first light of dawn crept across the floorboards, the satchel was packed and resting by the door. Margaret sat beside it, her shawl drawn tight, her hands clasped until her knuckles turned white. She had chosen the road, though it tore her in two. She would leave before he woke, vanish quietly, so that he could keep his name, his badge, his place in the world. The thought of his eyes searching for her twisted her chest, but she forced herself to believe it was the only way to protect him. The fire crackled low, the kettle whistled soft, and outside the prairie wind moaned across the valley. Inside the cabin, the choice had already been made, though her heart screamed against it. She would go, because staying would mean his ruin, and she could not bear to watch the man who had given her hope be broken by her shame. Spring settled soft over the valley, the snow retreating to the highest peaks and the earth greening with promise. The sheriff's cabin no longer stood as a lonely outpost against the wild, but as a place alive, with sound and warmth. Margaret knelt in the small patch of earth by the porch, her skirts tucked beneath her as she pressed seeds into the damp soil. The hens clucked around her, curious at her movements, and when one flapped too close, she laughed, brushing her hair from her face with the back of her wrist. The laughter rang clear and bright, carrying across the yard to where Caleb split fence rails beneath the Sunday. He paused, the axe held midair, just to hear it a moment longer. The sound easing something in him he had not known could heal. Children from neighboring farms rode up now and again, their voices quick with questions as they watched Margaret tend the garden. She showed them how to press a seed into soil, how to tell by feel where the ground was softest. Mothers who once crossed the street to avoid her now lingered by the fence, asking after bread recipes or offering to trade eggs for flour. Caleb noticed the change, slow but steady, and though he carried no illusions that gossip died easily, he knew the tide had turned. Respect, he had learned, was not won by fighting every tongue, but by standing steady long enough for the truth to take root. In town, he walked straighter when she was beside him, her hand resting light on his arm. The clerk no longer dared to sneer, and when he called her by the wrong name, Caleb corrected him without hesitation. "This is my wife, Mrs. Hale." The words came like a vow each time, and Margaret's chin lifted a little higher, her lips curving in a soft smile she no longer hid. For the first time, she was not spoken of as a widow bound to the mistakes of the dead, but as a woman chosen and cherished, a partner with her own place in the world. At the cabin one evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge and painted the sky in amber light, Margaret paused on the porch steps. She pressed her hand to her stomach, a gesture small and quiet, yet filled with meaning. Caleb saw it, his breath catching, though he said nothing. Instead, he stepped behind her, his arm circling her waist, his hand covering hers. Together they watched the horizon, not as two souls bound by sorrow, but as a family waiting for something more. The land stretched wide before them, full of hardships yet full of hope, and for once the future felt less like a storm to endure and more like a life to be built. Inside, the fire burned steady, its glow spilling across the walls that no longer held silence but laughter, conversation, and the unspoken bond of two people who had chosen to walk forward together. Out there on the frontier, where wind and dust tested every living thing, Caleb and Margaret had found not just survival but belonging, the kind of love forged in hardship and carried into tomorrow with steady hands. If this tale stirred your heart, we welcome you to subscribe to Western Love Legends, like, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. After all, even on the frontier, a good story is best when it's passed around the fire, and sometimes the rooster in the yard insists on crowing like he wrote it himself.